Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another fun episode of Indie Reads Aloud. Today, Deborah Reed is back in the studio with us. As I've mentioned before, I just adore her work, and I'm so excited that she keeps coming back and putting up with my nonsense. I'm so glad you keep coming back and reading. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so glad that you let me come back because I enjoy you very much, and I just really appreciate the chance to be able to share my work.
Thank you. Um, you have a stunning resume. I mean, stunning. Seriously. You've written thrillers, you've written horror, you've written young adult, um, you've written humorous memoir, nonfiction silliness. Is there any, and anybody who's interested, go and look in the show notes. You can see her entire list of all the 9,000 awards that Deborah's won and all the fun things that she's written. Is there any genre that you can imagine that you won't write?
Erotica will not be
Okay.
on my list.
All right, that's fair.
I always said fantasy wouldn't be either, but my daughter has gotten me to start a fantasy novel, probably more young adult fantasy. Well, the characters are young adult, whether and I'm sure adults would enjoy reading it as well, but um, yeah.
So is this a fantasy like Tolkien fantasy, or is this a fantasy like Harry Potter fantasy?
More magical realism where it's
Okay,
very similar to the real world but with magical elements instead
cool.
of creatures.
Okay, super fun. And I like that your children are pushing you to write new things in different genres. That's very entertaining.
Yes, I'm excited about it too, honestly, because I like to push myself. And at first I wasn't real excited about it, but the more that my daughter, because she loves writing fantasy and science fiction, and the more she
Mhm.
talked to me about it, and when I kind of started it, I'm like, "Ooh, this is kind of fun." And then we'll go on walks together. And just the other day, I said, "Hey, I'm having an issue with this right here," and she's like, just asked me a couple questions, and then was like, "All right, so you need to do this." And I was
That's
like,
so cool.
"You need to do that."
That is so neat. You get to collaborate with your children on books. That's very cool. So you collaborate with your husband on books, you collaborate with your children on books, you teach writing workshops all over the world. Uh, how is it that you have time to actually spill your imagination on the page?
Because
You,
I get up at 5:15 every morning.
oh, okay. All right. We're,
Yes.
we're we're gonna leave that one alone. I'm just gonna sit here and wallow in my I get up at 8 o'clock in the morning.
I I used to, and then I realized that if I do get up, I have the peace and quiet before everyone else in my world wakes up, and I actually get a lot done.
Yeah. My brain doesn't actually turn on till 8 o'clock, so I don't know that I would get more done.
It does take a lot of coffee, I'll give you
Well,
that.
but I do a lot in the middle of the night. So,
Yeah, I'm
midnight, 1 o'clock, two
comatose by,
o'clock.
like, 9, so
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're up at 5. So today you're going to read from book 1 of the Caitlin O'Reilly series, When Darkness Killed Her. I love this title. It just insinuates all kinds of very not great things.
um,
But this book, the only listener advisory really in it is mild violence. So this is a book that almost anyone can read, right?
yeah, as long as they are okay with having some violence, because I try not to describe in too much graphic detail what happens.
Mhm.
There is some violence, but I do try to keep language to a minimum or nothing.
Right. But it's not anything worse than we would see in an episode of Law and Order. So yeah, almost anybody can read it. However, if you do have little children with tiny ears listening to today's episode, you might want to preview this episode first, just so that we can remain accountable to those little ears.
Yes.
So let's talk about this book. before I let you read, I want you to tell me what drew you to this character, Caitlin O'Reilly. What is the thing about her that you said, okay, now I have to write a trilogy about this person?
I think she just fascinates me in the fact that she suffered a trauma at a young age, and now in the trilogy she's an adult and she's trying to find the answers to what happened to her before. And even though she's very vulnerable and in the sense that she um well, when darkness killed her, there that comes into play throughout the book, and so her fear of the dark is a very real thing. And she does have a lot of things that she has to work through, but she does, and she chooses to do that, and she, I think, is a very strong woman because of that, because she doesn't let what happens to her stop her, and she refuses to let anything happen to the people that she loves, or at least she does her best to try to protect them. Whereas a lot of people could, under those circumstances, tend to curl in on themselves and
Yeah,
avoid the world. And she has chosen to become a police officer and to take everything head on. And I just admire that about her.
that's so cool. So cool. I made a mistake and started reading book 2 of the trilogy first. So, so now I have to go back and start over.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff you would have missed.
Yeah, well, when we talked, that's what you said. And so now I set that one aside and I'm going back and starting from the beginning. So I'm really excited to hear how the story actually begins. When you are ready, please take the microphone and read aloud.
All right. Caitlin O'Reilly instinctively hunched forward as a bullet thudded into the wood at her back. Sawdust choked her, and she felt slivers of wood slicing through her police uniform shirt as she slid down the boards another inch, trying to make herself invisible. She had been there 5 minutes, and she was already drenched with sweat. Taking a deep breath, Caitlin adjusted her grip on the department issue 9mm that seemed embedded in her palms. You shouldn't be here, Caitlin, Donovan O'Reilly yelled as he spun around his own pallet of protective wood. He fired 2 shots toward their assailants, then dove back into hiding. You called me, Dad, Caitlin yelled, daring to peek around the wood. Another shot from across the warehouse splintered the wood inches from her face, pelting her with sharp fragments. Wincing, she ducked back behind the pallet, tearing one hand from the stranglehold on her gun to lightly touch her cheek. A bright red smear of blood covered her fingers when she pulled them away. Irritation tightened her features, and Caitlin glared at her father across the aisle. Come on, Caitlin muttered under her breath as her father shot up above his wood pallet to fire off another shot. Where are you? She had called for backup before entering the warehouse. As soon as she heard the first shot, Caitlin knew she couldn't keep her word to her father about coming alone. So where were the other officers? 2 bullets slammed into the wood her father crouched behind, and Caitlin thrust her arm around the side of her protective pallet and fired blindly in the direction the shots came from. How many are there? Caitlin yelled to her father as another volley of bullets rained down in their direction. Donovan ejected the magazine from his weapon. I'm out, he called, waving the empty gun at his daughter. Caitlin fumbled at the side of the leather belt strapped around her waist. Tearing open the Velcro on the fabric case, she took out a magazine and slid it across the aisle where her father waited with an outstretched hand. Snatching the magazine, Donovan slammed it home and leaned back against the wood. 2, I think, Donovan said, wiping sweat from his forehead. That's it? Caitlin asked in disbelief, fighting a hysterical urge to laugh. They were pinned down by only 2 gunmen. It seemed like they were under attack by an entire army. They're trained, Caitlin, Donovan said, running a hand over his silver hair. You've got to get out of here. I would never have called you if I had known. Known what? Caitlin wanted to ask, but another round of fire stopped her from speaking. When the warehouse fell silent again, Caitlin peered around her pallet, then at her father. I'll go, but you have to go first. Donovan shook his head rapidly. I need to cover you, or you'll never make it out alive. We're leaving together, or we're dying together, Caitlin yelled as Donovan spun out to fire off another 3 shots. Her words were tough, but terror lodged in her throat. Her stubbornness came from her father, unaltered genetic code. She knew him well enough to know he would never leave until she was on her way out the door in front of him. Waiting until the answering volley of bullets died down, Donovan looked across the aisle at his daughter. What did you get into, Dad? Caitlin rasped harshly as she locked eyes with her father. Donovan's face remained stoic, and he stared at her without blinking. It was hot in the warehouse, unbearably hot, and sweat rolled down his temples and soaked his shirt. He stayed silent. Dad, I left Derek standing in a gas station convenience store with a bag of chips and a Mountain Dew dangling from his fingertips, Caitlin spat, anger coating her words. She fought for control over her emotions, but lost the battle quickly. My partner. Answer my question. The last three words were driven across the aisle in a succinct, no-nonsense manner. What is going on? Donovan O'Reilly's gaze shifted away from his daughter casually, and Caitlin felt a scream building in the back of her throat. The man was insufferable. On three, Donovan said quietly, his eyes peering around the wood before coming back to rest on his daughter. Caitlin immediately shifted her position, her combat boots scraping across the concrete. Every instinct told her not to follow his directions. Her pride told her to ignore them, but she didn't have a choice. She had seen that look on her father's face her entire life. Donovan was following his own orders, no one else's, and she could obey or fall behind. 1. Donovan edged his shoulder closer to the edge of the pallet. Caitlin wiped sweat from her brow. 2. Where were the other police officers? Why weren't they barging in, guns blazing? 3, Donovan yelled, and Caitlin launched herself forward, toward the door she knew lay behind rows of wood and heavy machinery, yet couldn't see. Caitlin heard her father begin firing, ducked her head down when their attackers began returning fire. Then she heard a sound she knew would haunt her for life. The dull thud was a different sound than that of a bullet hitting wood. The grunt that followed sent icy fear down her spine, and Caitlin pivoted in mid-stride, having taken only a few steps. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as Caitlin's gaze landed on the prone figure of her father, blood pumping onto the concrete from a wound directly over Donovan O'Reilly's heart. Dad! Caitlin screamed. She lunged back toward her father, stumbled, fell to her hands and knees as her gun clattered across the hard floor and out of reach. Caitlin scrambled the few feet to her father's body on her hands and knees, unaware that the warehouse had fallen eerily silent. Dad, please, Caitlin sobbed, tears blinding her as the words fell from her lips. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she cradled her father's face in her hands, then moved them to his neck to find a pulse. Her anger was instantly erased, fear riding hard in its wake. You can't do this, Caitlin whispered as her fingers found nothing but warm flesh. You can't do this, she screamed, the primal cry ripping from her lungs as she pressed her palms flat against the wound in her father's chest. Blood. There was so much blood. Her knees slipped as she fought to find purchase in the widening crimson pool flowing across the concrete. You can't die on me, Caitlin whispered as she leaned down and placed her cheek against Donovan's. You can't die on me. The sound was like a cannon going off, and fiery pain ripped through Caitlin's shoulder. She collapsed over her father's body, her eyes wide in shock as agony permeated every cell of her body. Her mind ordered her to get her gun, her father's gun, any weapon. But her body wouldn't obey her commands, and her mind felt dull. Her eyes were closing of their own volition, and she fought it because she knew that meant the end. Caitlin heard them coming. Boots slid across concrete, the sound of death toll to her ears. Stay awake, Caitlin ordered herself, even as her eyes slid closed. The footsteps stopped, halting at the edge of where her blood mixed with her father's. Then there was nothing. The full skirt of her knee-length black dress brushed lightly against Caitlin's legs as she emerged from her car, wincing slightly. Taking a moment to adjust the strap of the sling cradling her arm, she then began walking toward the back door of her father's firm. Emblazoned in white letters across the metal door leading into the alley were the words Night Watch Investigations. Except you won't be watching anymore, will you, Dad? Caitlin thought to herself as she fitted the key into the lock. Of course, if all the people at the funeral could be believed, Donovan O'Reilly would be watching over his daughter from heaven every moment of every day. Well-intentioned family and friends wanting to make things better. Caitlin wished she believed her father was keeping an eye on her from above, but she couldn't partake in that particular sentiment. The problem arose from the fact that Caitlin herself had died. She didn't remember any bright lights, and she definitely didn't remember any ability to look down on those she loved. There had simply been an all-encompassing darkness. The darkness that, at least, had been better than the pain. Though metal, the door opened soundlessly on well-oiled hinges. Caitlin didn't expect anything less. There wasn't any detail about this building or Donovan O'Reilly's work that would escape his notice or fall into disrepair. Conscientious to a fault about everything but his daughter. Once inside, Caitlin paused, breathing deeply. She didn't smell anything of her father here, nothing that would trigger memories from her teenage years or through to the present. Smelled like new carpet. Caitlin vaguely remembered her father mentioning a local company had installed new carpet the week before. The heels of her black pumps sank into the plush flooring as she followed the hallway toward the front of the building. The emergency light stayed on throughout the night and shed enough light for her to avoid feeling as if she was drowning, but she still felt the prickle across her shoulders, still felt sweat forming under her hair at the nape of her neck. She hated darkness. Midway to the front, a soft glow made Caitlin pull up short. She let her small handbag slide from her good shoulder and soundlessly fall to the ground. Bending at the waist, she reached inside the soft leather and extracted her personal weapon of choice, a PX4 Storm Beretta. It slid into her palm, a perfect fit, and Caitlin continued down the hall, the gun extended and ready. It was a testament to her shaken mental state that Caitlin didn't bother sneaking up on whoever was in the foyer of Night Watch investigations. She simply walked into the light. Relief was instant at being in a well-lit room, but her eyes stayed narrow as she swept the bread in an arc, covering the room in seconds, until it came to rest on a large black woman sitting at the lobby counter, her own gun trained between Caitlin's eyes. They both lowered their weapons at the same time. "You beat me here," Caitlin said tonelessly, not really surprised to see her father's office manager sitting at the desk she had occupied for 17 years. Loretta Lewis, Mama Lewis to those who could get away with calling her that, placed her Heckler & Koch .45 handgun on her desk and stood to her feet. "I needed to feel him for a few more minutes before going home, ain't it? He was never more alive than when he was on a job." Caitlin allowed her petite 5'5" frame to be swallowed by the woman who had been like a second mother to her for almost 20 years. People often misjudged the short, heavy-set woman with black hair, billowing skirts, and peasant tops, assuming the older woman with gray streaks running through her hair was simply a grandmotherly type hired to push paperwork. Those who tried getting around the granite counter without permission, however, met the full wrath of Mama Lewis, and some even met Mr. Heckler and Mr. Koch, as Loretta liked to call the baby she kept hidden in the drawer near her leg. No one spoke to Donovan O'Reilly unless Mama Lewis deemed him or her worthy of her boss's time. Caitlin felt Loretta's hand slide down her thick chestnut hair, the same as she used to do when Caitlin was a child. "What do you need, ain't it?" Mama Lewis crooned in her ear. That voice and the nickname her father christened her with as an infant almost broke through Caitlin's wall. Almost. Ain't it meant little fire to the Irish. There were only a select few allowed to call Caitlin by that name. Between the incident 17 years prior and her father's death several days ago, Caitlin felt that what little fire remained was building, roiling inside, fanning into an inferno. She didn't feel many emotions right now. There was emptiness, confusion, and rage. Lots and lots of rage. "I think I just want to sit at his desk for a while," Caitlin said dully as she pulled back from Mama Lewis. The large woman nodded firmly. "Go be near your daddy. I'll make sure you aren't bothered. Unless there's someone you want me to allow through." "Troy," Caitlin said quietly as she turned to walk back down the hall. "Just Troy." After retrieving her handbag, Caitlin turned into the last office on the right, flipping on every light in the room as she walked across the vast space. Loretta had always griped that Donovan should have the very first office off the foyer, but Caitlin knew why her father chose this one. It was quiet, no distractions as people came and went from the foyer. He could be in his own little world back in his office. Tossing her handbag on the burgundy leather chair in front of her father's desk, Caitlin gently laid her gun on the desk and sank down into the plush leather of the high-backed office chair, immediately kicking off her shoes. Running a hand down her face, Caitlin leaned her head back and simply went still. There were so many questions, so much anger. Who had killed her father? Why was he even at that warehouse? Why had his killers let her live? Why was she allowed to walk away with just a bullet in her shoulder instead of one between the eyes? Caitlin didn't understand why she was still breathing, sitting in her dead father's office, smothered by questions and a suffocating, unshakable wrath. Then there was the emptiness. She was alone now, truly alone. Amelia O'Reilly had been the light of Caitlin's life for 5 glorious years. Then a 60-year-old man had a heart attack while driving down the expressway, jumped the median, and embedded his car in the front of her mother's Honda. Mercifully, if such a word could be used about such a tragedy, Amelia was killed instantly. Caitlin had been home with her father. Amelia was alone in the car. Donovan's world had been shattered with the death of his beloved. Caitlin believed her parents shared the love of storybooks and movies, the kind of love that only came once in a lifetime. The fact her father never remarried, never even came close to choosing another wife, confirmed that belief for Caitlin. Father and daughter forged a connection few parents ever experienced with their offspring. The death of the woman they both loved more than any other welded them together, creating a steadfast and precious bond. They became each other's best friend, and Caitlin often chose activities with her father over those with her school friends. Then she turned 13, was kidnapped, and died. There isn't any kind of relationship that can survive death, Caitlin thought as she slowly turned her eyes toward the ceiling.
Wow. Okay. Really got to stop writing such tremendously great books because it's difficult to choose what to read next.
I'm sorry.
It's one of the things I like best about our indie author community, and one of the things that simultaneously frustrates me most. Everybody writes such great story.
Yes, I've had a hard time with all of your festivals and the things that I've heard through readings and everything, trying to figure out what to buy first and how to fit them all in, and it's hard.
It's a challenge. I haven't written a series yet, so I'm very curious. How did you discover that Caitlin had more adventures than just one book?
Her story in the end of the first book, it could have ended as a standalone with a little bit of a more ambiguous ending that, you know, the reader could have kind of filled in the blanks if they wanted to and just left it there.
Mm-hmm.
Then someone had read it and said, so when's the next one coming out? And I said, what do you mean? They're like, well, with the way it ended, I assumed there was another one. And of course, that always gets my mind going.
Yeah.
And then I can't get it to stop. And I honestly had fallen in love with all of the characters, like all of the characters in that trilogy. Just, I don't know. They all were so unique and had such wonderful characteristics about them that I loved. And I'm like, no, it does need to go farther. We need to figure out where all of this is going. We need to resolve some of these the stories of the other characters as well, because they all kind of have their own story of things that have happened to them. And
Right.
it just took off, and I wrote the second one, and that one ends on a cliffhanger. So then you got to buy the third one.
So we were talking before about how you don't think there's going to be any more Caitlin books. Probably not. She's probably finished with her story arc.
Yeah.
So does it feel then, as an author, does it feel more like the children have grown and moved away from home, and now you're inviting new children into your household to raise? And is it is even close to that? I mean, I know that's a weird analogy, but is it even close to that?
It is, because I mean, so I wrote one of these a year. So for 3 years, I lived with these characters, and then all of a sudden, yeah, they graduated. They got published, and their
Yeah.
stories are done for right now. And um, but at the same point, there are other stories that are coming in, and other characters who I'm falling in love with and that need their story told. And so, yeah, it's an ending and a beginning.
It's like
Constantly.
cycle of life thing.
Yes.
That's awesome. I'm so glad you came back, and we'll have you back again for as many stories as you write. I know we still have more that we haven't heard from yet.
Yes.
So we'll definitely be doing that. And then the new ones coming up, we'll definitely be doing those. So anybody who's listened to this program and you've heard Deborah Reed before, just subscribe and just keep listening, because she'll be back.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. I really enjoyed having you.
It was great to be here.